is officially open with the first pick, with the second pick, with the 32nd pick. The Detroit Lions select, the Jacksonville Jaguars select, the Carolina Panthers select, the Green Bay Packers select Jordan Love.
Oh my God. Come on. I cannot believe it.
One of the best times to draft a quarterback is when you don't need one.
Why didn't you get a wide receiver in a wide receiver rich draft?
Packers window is closed.
Good evening and welcome to episode 2 of Talking Sports with Evan, NFL Draft Talk. And this week got a great guest coming onto the show. Got Jacob joining me today. And Jacob, thank you so much for coming on. The NFL Draft is coming up very fast, end of April. I put my PTO in for work so I can be there. And I'm sure you're going to be there as well. I'm definitely looking forward to, of all places, Green Bay, Wisconsin to hold the NFL Draft. But with that, thank you for coming on, and I appreciate you spending some time here with me to talk some NFL Draft.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I put my PTO request in September, so it has long since been planned. It also helps the boss at my full-time is a Packer fan, so basically I can just tell him, hey, it's for Packer stuff, and he'll just be like, oh, I get it. So, yeah, I will definitely be there in April, taking in the scene. I've already got my places to stay, and then I'm just working on making it so I don't have to drive anywhere because I imagine that's going to be a bit of a zoo. And if you're anything like me, I hate traffic. So I have like an irrational hatred for traffic, but it certainly is there. But I'm excited. It's a opportunity for the rest of the world to see a city that I love so very much, and kind of for all the charm that it possesses in a world that is very corporatized, as you've been to. I'm sure, Evan, you've been to other stadiums. You can tell the drastic difference between wherever it is and Lambeau Field.
Yeah, so I haven't been to another NFL stadium for a football game, but I've been to NFL stadiums for other events. Like I've been to Tennessee, been to New Orleans, and you definitely get that feel even when they're not set up for NFL games. But definitely get what you're saying. I didn't quite put mine back in September. I had to wait till after January 1, but my boss did approve it today. Got the notification in my email. It's been approved, so I'm good to go. And Packers season ends with a wild card loss to the Philadelphia Eagles, eventual Super Bowl champions. And obviously, the Packers have some work to do this offseason, free agency, and the draft. Now, when you look at the draft this year, we're going to look at the big picture of the draft first before we narrow our focus to the Packers in particular. But I guess before we get to that, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Why don't you let the people watching know where they can find your work? I know I have it at the bottom of the screen there and whatnot, but just let people know where they can find your work.
Yeah, so every Tuesday you can listen to me on the Pack a Day podcast started by Andy Herman. I am one of the OG members, and now with the retirement looming of Andrew Mertig, I believe other than Andy, I will be the most frequent guest on that show. So that's exciting. It's a lot of fun, and shout out to Mertig. He and I were definitely competing for that top spot for a while, but Andrew's a good guy. Dr. Andrew Mertig, as I like to call him, because he has his PhD. He's a lot smarter than all of us, really, but especially me. And then Bill Huber, his site, Packers on SI is what it's called. You'll catch my coverage there. Actually, you mentioned the Eagles game. I was fortunate enough to be able to fly to Philadelphia and cover that game for Packers Eagles. I did not know that I was going to be watching the eventual Super Bowl champions. But anybody who's kind of followed me and my work and my story for the last 3 or 4 years knows that, Philadelphia is a pretty special stadium to me as well. So that was pretty cool to be able to be there for that. So you can find me there. I do various radio hits I'm on Better Call Eversol with Marcus Eversol frequently enough. And then John Papadopoulos on ESPN 105 and lacrosse. I'll do some stuff with him. And then really whoever calls and asks, I love doing this stuff. So if you call me and ask me, hey, do you got 10 minutes to do a podcast or radio hit? My answer is almost always yes, unless I've got my 2 little kids who keeping them quiet throughout a radio hit is difficult. But yeah, that's where you can find me. And then at the bottom, it also says the Green Bay Draft Guide. That's a project from myself, Jacob Morley, who's my partner on Tuesdays for the Pack a Day podcast, and Ross Uglum, the publisher of Packer Report, my longtime friend. The 3 of us will throw that together, have a lot of fun with that. done some stuff with the Cheesehead TV draft guide once upon a time, not currently with the Green Bay draft guide. Obviously, that felt a little repetitive, I suppose, but it's a lot of fun. Buy both guides, get all the perspectives that you can, because as I always like to say, the draft is an art. It's not a science.
Yeah, it's definitely an art. If it was a science, the people that do the mock drafts would probably be a lot more accurate with their mock drafts. So I don't know if Piper's the godfather, as people like to call him, but there's a lot of great draft content out there, and I do appreciate your content and the Pack-A-Day draft guide, She Said TV draft guide, and then The Athletic has a really good draft guide they put together now too that I like. So I try to consume every bit of it I can get to get everybody's perspective, to try to get my best insight on my feelings on it too. So I definitely agree with, get your Pack-A-Day guide, She Said TV guide, definitely go ahead and get those. So
yeah, it's a lot of fun to look back to after a couple years. Like I was reading today, an old scouting report on Jalen Hurts, and just like how much stuff in there was like right on the money. Football character, poise, character, just stuff like that. And then like you see the stuff of guys that maybe they were wrong about, too. Like Rashawn Gary is a name that certainly comes to mind. They said that it would take probably 3 years for him. It took a year and a half maybe for him to start being pretty productive. But that was a fun, like I said, I don't need to feel like I'm smarter than everybody when it comes to this stuff. I like the guys I like. I end up lower on guys than I should sometimes too. And then you learn from like, where did I make those mistakes, and then try and learn from them that way. And then, name your best general manager in football, Howie Roseman, Brett Veach, Brad Holmes of Detroit, whatever. They've had some stinkers too. Like I said, the draft, it's an art. It's not a science. And if it were a science, then it'd be a hell of a lot easier for everybody.
Yeah, I know right now everybody's talking about how Howie's the way to go, but it wasn't too long ago that he had to make the moves that he did to improve the roster because of some stinkers that he has. Hey, it happens all the time. But this year's draft in particular, I've seen a lot of big boards with Abdullah Carter on the top, Travis Hunter on the top, guys like that. Mason Graham I've seen towards the top of a lot of people's big boards, defensive tackle from Michigan. What does your big board look like currently?
Yeah. So the way I would, just for like full disclosure, the way that I do draft work is I am a college football fan as well. My header photo is a helmet from the University of Michigan. So go blue. But I consume those games during the season as a fan. And then once the season's over, that's when I start looking at guys as draft prospects. So I get maybe a little bit later of a start than some people do. I guess I do start a little earlier than I used to with the college football playoff being as long as it is now. So like I watched the guys from Ohio State and Notre Dame before the national championship game, which was played at the end of January. But just for some of those guys, Travis Hunter is interesting to me just because I'm curious what position is he going to play. People I talk to that maybe know a little bit more than I do on the subject seem to think the NFL thinks he's better suited to play cornerback. But with the money that gets thrown at receivers financially, it might be in his best interest to try and play receiver. So I'm interested to see what way that goes. I think he's good at either one. I don't know if he's the best prospect at either position, but his two-way ability is intriguing enough. He'll be at the top of that stuff. You mentioned Mason Graham. If positional value was thrown out the window, and of course it can't be, but Mason Graham would be the number one overall pick in this class, I think. And I say that with all maize and blue bias aside. This is a guy who, if you want to know the value of Mason Graham, watch Ohio State's offense against every other team they played this year, and then watch them against Michigan. It's night and day difference. And the reason for that is because of Graham's ability to just completely control the line of scrimmage. Kenneth Grant, obviously a big part of that as well. But Michigan's defensive tackle tandem was probably the best in the country in that regard. So the top of the class, but the best player after that, to me, it's between Graham and then Abdul Carter from Penn State. That guy is electricity on the screen. And I was kind of hoping that they would get to play for the national championship game. The Final Four was a complete nightmare for me this year because other than Texas, so once Texas lost to Ohio State, it was a disaster. But Notre Dame, Penn State, Ohio State, not exactly on the list of favorite teams for me. I didn't want to see any of them win, but
Badger fan, I feel you on that.
Yeah, it's not any different, right? So getting Carter, I would have liked to see him against Ohio State's offense again, just to see what he could have done. But he is, like I said, as good as it gets. I'm I imagine the Cleveland Browns were having dreams of pairing Carter with Myles Garrett. We'll see how that situation plays out with Garrett. But I think that either way, it's like you can either pair him or you can try to replace him that way. But those are the guys, I think, the top of the class, those are pretty much your players that it's going to be pretty consensus that way. But yeah, those are the top guys, I think. And guys that you don't want to play, he won't be there, but those guys probably aren't making it to 23.
Well, it is a quarterback-driven league. I noticed you're talking about top of your draft for the two quote-unquote top quarterbacks in the draft didn't mention yet. And I've seen some places that if they weren't quarterbacks, they probably wouldn't be first-round picks. And I've seen people picking them number one, but that's Shedeur Sanders, Cam Ward.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on them in this year's draft? Are they as good as advertised, or is there more flaws than good with them right now?
I am thankful that the Packers have Jordan Love, is how this quarterback class makes me feel. That's not to say I don't think those guys are talented players. They'll probably get overdrafted because they are quarterbacks, like you mentioned. I talked to a guy who he works for the East-West Shrine Bowl, which is the all-star game that Shedeur Sanders played at. And Sanders he didn't play. I'm sorry. He interviewed only. But still, from a football character standpoint, poise, collection, all the hoopla that surrounds him for being Deion Sanders' son, he said he couldn't handle that any better. So from that standpoint, I do like Shedeur Sanders. I do think if he does not do well in the NFL, it won't be because the moment was too big for him or he got rattled by something or anything like that. I don't think the fact that a lot of the stuff that surrounds him as far as his quote unquote baggage isn't even his fault. Like it's not his fault that Deion Sanders has a big personality and is his father. And like Shedeur said at the All-Star game, I didn't know it was a bad thing that your parents wanted what was best for you. And he was present and everything like that, which I thought was a good answer by Sanders. And he's right. It's not a bad thing that Sanders wants that. The problem that he's going to run into is anytime that Sanders throws an incomplete pass or they go 3 and out and punt, some pundit, some shock jock is going to be tweeting about how, let's just say the New York Giants, do the Giants need to fire Brian Daboll and hire Deion Sanders? The weight of that eventually can become a big thing. But from a pure on the field standpoint, he's probably a late first, early second round type of player, but he's going to get drafted in the top 10 because, like I said, he plays quarterback. Cam Ward, probably more physical attributes than Shedeur Sanders has. Just interested to see how that translates to the next level and where it is. And as you know, Evan, as well as I do, sometimes the situation matters so much more than the player sometimes. Like Bo Nix ended up in Denver, really good situation for him. Some of the others, JJ McCarthy, if he had been able to play last year, would have been in a really good situation. Caleb Williams, not so much. Chicago's situation, despite the hoopla and pomp and circumstance that surrounds it, not the greatest group of coaches, offensive linemen, wide receivers, all that stuff, running game, everything that goes into play with playing quarterback. And then, of course, you got Jaden Daniels, who's offensive rookie of the year, and he was in a really good situation with Washington, as it turns out. I don't think anybody was thinking that way when everything started, but it was a really good situation for him. So that's what I think about those guys. They'll get overdrafted, but the quarterback situation, you always want, if you don't need a quarterback, you want quarterbacks to get overdrafted because it pushes better players down to you.
Yeah, and have a, I guess, follow and that was the point I made in my show last week is when you have a draft like last year, Bo Nix, who to me was not a first round talent, and I know he had a great rookie year, but I didn't see him as a first round talent. He went top 12 because, hey, he was a quarterback, and that allowed other guys to slide a little bit to be drafted. But looking at this year's draft, what I hear defensive line in particular, big position strength in this year's draft. What are your thoughts on this year's draft? What are your positions of strength, and what is your position of, besides quarterback, I guess, weakness?
Yeah, this is a line of scrimmage draft, which is probably good timing for the Packers, considering what we saw yesterday in the Super Bowl with the Eagles just, pardon my phrasing, but beating the absolute piss out of Kansas City on both sides of that line of scrimmage. Offensive linemen, I think there's some good depth to that part of the class, which is kind of where Brian Gutekunst thrives, is finding some of those later round diamonds in the rough, so to speak. And really the defensive line, I think the pass rush class is not as good as like when Aiden Hutchinson was there, or like the Brian Burns, Rashawn Gary, that kind of class. But there's some good players there. And then the defensive tackle class, I mentioned Mason Graham. Tyleik Williams from Ohio State certainly qualifies. Kenneth Grant from Michigan's another guy. And then there's other guys as you go down the line as well. But if you need a defensive tackle, and I do think Green Bay does, as of right now, and this isn't really what you asked me, but I think on February 10th, as we record this, and I do reserve the right to change my mind on this, but I think where the sweet spot of value, need, everything that's going to fit at 23 is going to land on defensive linemen. And that can change, obviously. But I do think it's a strong class. And that way, I think it's a strong class at the top of the cornerback group. I mentioned Travis Hunter earlier, Will Johnson from Michigan, Jahdae Barron from Texas, Sharon Revel from East Carolina. There's some guys there that could have some possibilities. Jalon Walker as a linebacker, pass rusher type is an interesting case to me as well. Receiver group, tight ends has two guys at the top. I really don't know what else there. Tyler Warren, Colson Loveland being those two guys. Receivers, if you're looking for, Josh Jacobs was talking about the Packers needing a number one receiver. I don't know if that guy exists in this class. I don't personally feel like a quote unquote number one receiver is a necessity, but not a bad thing to have, certainly. And I really like the running back class as well. So kind of working all the way around there to get to where we landed there. But why, if you want to run the ball and play defense, basically, this is the draft class for you. Offensive linemen, defensive linemen, running backs, and players like that. Receivers, not so much. Quarterback class, like we mentioned, not the greatest. Maybe some good, low end starters and backups like Shadir Sanders and Ward and those. Jackson Dart, I know, is a name that's probably going to jump up as we keep going here. But there's some guys there. Thankfully, the Packers have needs. It feels like at the positions where the class is shaped well, and maybe not so many need. Like they don't need a quarterback, for example. So that's good news. I think they're pretty well set there. But interested to see how this draft class takes shape. The combine, Evan, it's only in 2 weeks, so we're right into it.
Yeah, combine's going to be here before we know it, too. Focusing more on Green Bay. With the first pick in the draft, 23rd overall, who are some guys Packer fans should get familiar with as potential options at 23? I know you mentioned a couple guys that I've heard mentioned to Green Bay, a couple of the corners in particular, but who are some guys that Packer fans should get to know?
Yeah, I think you're going to see a lot of cornerbacks, which makes sense right now. Keyshawn Nixon, Carrington Valentine are probably the odds-on favorites to be starters at those positions just because of the uncertain future of Jair Alexander. Certainly a thing that could come into play here. I think you'll see that a lot. So Jahdae Barron, I mentioned from Texas. Will Johnson is interesting. I thought he was like a slam dunk top 10 pick, and now, again, it's February 10th. But Eric Edholm, for example, from NFL.com, had him 21st to Pittsburgh. So that wasn't oops, I got to get him in there. Like there's something to that potentially. Obviously, a lot can change between now and then. Revel from East Carolina, I just mentioned. This guy, those are some defensive backs you could certainly get your name familiar with. But really, again, I said defensive tackle is where this value and need thing is going to be. Kenneth Grant, one tech from Michigan. He's 340 pounds. He says he's going to run a 4.8 at the combine. If he does that, I don't know if he's available at 23, but from a big and athletics, Ted Thompson used to always say that the good Lord only made so many men that big that can move. And if you guys want an example, I believe it's Nick Singleton. If it's not, it's Katron Allen. But one of the backs from Penn State in the 2023 Michigan-Penn State game at Happy Valley looks like he's on a breakaway. And Kenneth Grant is the one who chases him down. And it is incredibly impressive when you consider just, again, the size of that player. Tyleik Williams from Ohio State's the other one. I think those are the two guys right now. Green Bay walks away with one of those players as a defensive tackle in the first round. They have size and they have – think of – this is a very loose comparison, but TJ Slayton with higher upside from a pass rush standpoint. Kenneth Grant has flashed some there, and with that athleticism, you think he can rush the passer. Ditto for Tyleik Williams. Just penetrators, disruptors. The Packers, again, I'm going to harp on this all off season, and people like to make fun of me for how much I wax poetic about the Eagles, but I love the way that team's built. And 2 Super Bowl appearances in 3 seasons, the proof is in the pudding. Like, you saw the way Philadelphia was able to just win with their front 4 against Kansas City, and they turned Patrick Mahomes, the best quarterback of this generation, into a mortal. Green Bay thought they had a defensive line like that coming into the season. It turns out they didn't. Now, they need some internal solutions. Obviously, Lucas Van Ness needs to play better. Rashawn Gary, same thing. Kenny Clark needs to play better. Devontae Wyatt needs to be more consistent, so on and so forth. But you can never have enough juice as a pass rush. And really, my opinion is if you don't have Philadelphia's offensive line from this year or their defensive line from this year, then you can always stand to add to that position group. Because if you're good enough, you're probably not good enough to win in the biggest spots.
Well, the Packers did have that type of defensive line when they played the Colts and the Titans. But outside of that, if you could play the Colts and the Titans every week, the Packers would be Super Bowl champions. But unfortunately, they're not. So a couple of names I've seen thrown out there that are more freak athletes that need work. We know how much the Packers seem to love freak athletes that need some development. But
Sure.
Shamir Stewart from Texas A&M and Ma'Khel Williams from Georgia. What are your general thoughts on them? Do you think they could be contributors from day one, or would it be more of your Rashawn Gary, Lucas Van Ness type that needs some time to learn how to be an NFL player?
Yeah, I will say this. I do adopt the Peter Bukowski theory of most rookies are not good because they're rookies. They have a lot to learn. Like guys like Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean from Philadelphia, they're rare. You know what I mean? Like guys like that contributing that much early, it's pretty rare. I'm not going to turn my nose up at the idea because Rashawn Gary is a really good player. Is he a great player? No. But he's really good. So I think we're starting there was a point where we overrated Gary like before he got his contract extension. And now I kind of feel like we're underrating him a little bit because he is a good player and people are treating it as if he's kind of a bust for like when people say Gutekunst has never hit on a first round pick or whatever. It's like, well, Gary's a hit. Like he's not a superstar, but that's a good player, which is ultimately what you want in the first round. Shamar Stewart, I think, is somebody who I think it was Tyler Brooks said, I wouldn't be surprised to see like a Trayvon Walker ascension for him where like this was around 23, 24, 25 is where they thought he was going to land in that draft class. And he ended up getting picked first ahead of Aiden Hutchinson in that class. So I don't know, again, in February, if Shamar Stewart's going to be available at 23, but if he is, I don't think Gutekunst is going to be able to help himself. Guys that big are not supposed to be able to move like that. So I understand the idea. It's the same with understanding the idea of Lucas Van Ness. And I'm not writing off Lucas Van Ness yet either, albeit with the understanding, yes, it has been a disappointing first 2 seasons, especially a second season for Lucas Van Ness. Ma'Khel Williams, same thing. Traits on traits on traits. I don't know if they would ask him to contribute from day one. With some of the guys they already have there, that is something Gutekunst has tried to do, where, you know, Gary was behind the Super Smith brothers of that time. Now, if you draft a guy like that, Gary, Van Ness, Enigbare, Brenton Cox, those are guys that all could play ahead of that player. Now, you don't love that because with the way that rookie contracts are structured and everything like that, you want to be able to take advantage of cheap labor, essentially. You know, that was kind of one of the downsides to the way the Packers did things with Jordan Love, right? Jordan Love sits for 3 seasons. You got to play 1 season with Jordan Love on a cheap contract. And then you had to give him this massive contract extension, which is why I thought like last year, he could have been a one and done. Like if Love stunk, the Packers could have potentially looked to move on after just 1 season. Obviously he didn't. He's a franchise quarterback now. I wonder if Gutekunst, with his comments about urgency and everything like that, I'm not saying the Packers got to change the way they do things because in general, they're very successful and they have been. And I don't want that to get lost because they had a disappointing season based on the expectations on that team. But I do wonder if he tweaks things a little bit with the idea of we're trying to win a Super Bowl right now, because I think it's a fair criticism, but not like this death knell that people have that Green Bay, I think it was Aaron Nagler, put it perfectly about Ted Thompson. And it was Ted's insistence that a team in the future will be covered is why his current team will come up short. And the Packers in general have kind of looked at things that way. Like Lucas Van Ness, they take him even though at the time they have Gary and Preston and some of those guys. And it's just like, well, yeah, but now Van Ness in 2026, 2025 could be a star at the expense of, 2023. Or Jordan Love is a really good example of that. Like the Packers didn't pick a player to win now. They picked a player to win in 2023 at the expense of maybe some help for one of those 2020 or 2021 teams to win the Super Bowl. Worked out, but I don't think the Packers need to reinvent the way they do things, but I do wonder if they tweak things a little bit with a look on getting more guys early. And again, I don't want to poo-poo the idea that like Edgerrin Cooper was a contributor. Evan Williams was a contributor. Like they got contributions from the draft class. It was just that their first round pick was injured, and that kind of stinks that your first round pick ends the season on the sideline because they certainly could have used him in that wild card game against Philly after Elton Jenkins went down. Because basically the game, for all intents and purposes, was probably over once Jenkins left the game because they're not going to be able to block Philly's front like that. So I'm interested to see how they do things. It wouldn't shock me at all, though, if at the end we're like, okay, another freak athlete with some traits, and maybe he'll be ready to contribute in 2027.
When you look at this Packer roster, what are your areas? I don't really guess. I don't know if these are what I want to say. But what are your areas of concern right now with how the roster is made up right now?
Yeah, so if Alexander's not back, I think defensive back is certainly there. I am concerned about defensive line and pass rush in general. I am a very firm believer, like you guys have probably figured out throughout the duration of this episode, that you can never have too many players there. With the injuries at the receiver position, I think that changes the calculus there. Certainly Christian Watson may not play until he had surgery in mid to late January.
November, I want to say, is what his dad's saying on that.
Yeah, right. So October, November, and that's assuming everything's normal, right? Which we've seen David Bakhtiari, for example, of an injury that wasn't normal. Knock on wood, not wishing that on anybody or anything. So with that in mind, Watson, and then you have Dobbs with 1-2 concussions last year. And let's not forget he was suspended for conduct detrimental to the team. Is that a situation that lingers into 2025? I don't know if it does or not. I don't have any reason to believe that it would, but Christian Watson said into a microphone, it's going to take a while to get that family feeling back. I don't think it was all hunky-dory when Dobbs returned to the locker room after being suspended. That's a situation that could certainly work itself out. These are grown men, but Green Bay does need, they don't need Jamar Chase. They don't need Justin Jefferson. They don't need this quote unquote go-to guy like that. Can they stand to get better at that position? Certainly. If Devontae Adams wants to come back to Green Bay, I don't know if he does or not, but if he does, I would take him. Chris Godwin, if he wants to play in Green Bay, I would certainly take someone like him. Are there guys in the draft that could help Green Bay next year as well? Absolutely. There are players. I think those are the skill positions and the interior, like the spines is what I would say. So the outside and inside of both sides of the ball, especially with their center, Josh Myers is a free agent. You could probably stand to get better than him at that spot. And it's a tough position to try and fill. It's an adjustment with protections and everything like that, throwing a lot on a rookie if that's the route that they do choose to go. So interior and exterior, which sounds like I'm saying the whole team, but it really is. Yeah. That interior, the offensive line and the receiver position on offense, and then defense, the line of scrimmage and defensive backs.
Yeah. And I think, and I'm not saying take linebacker in the first round. We've seen what happens when the Packers do that. But I think linebacker is another position they could get stronger. And you got Edgerrin Cooper, and then you have Quay Walker, who has shown flashes, especially late in the year last year, but has not really been the first round pick you're hoping he is. And then McDuffie and Eric Wilson, I believe, are both free agents. You have Hooper, or is it Hopper? Forget his name off the top of my head.
Hopper,
Walker in your linebacker room, and that's pretty much it right now. Is there any linebackers, like maybe second, third, fourth rounds that you like in this year's draft that could definitely add to the talent in that room?
Yeah, I do think they're probably a player short there. I don't think they would take one early. I do think that Gutekunst, LaFleur, Jeff Halfley, Xavier McKinney, Anthony Campanelli's not there anymore, or Sean Duke, like unprompted, have spoken highly of Quay Walker. Very high, like glowingly, like they think he's a star type of glowingly, which flies in the face of the way the internet talks about Quay Walker. Whose opinion matters when it comes to, is he playing? Is he starting? Is he getting a contract? I think that they are very excited about the potential of Walker playing next to Edgerrin Cooper, getting a full season and a full off season under his belt. Because remember, Edge missed a decent portion of training camp and also was kind of nicked throughout some of the year. So getting him to be able to practice throughout the course of the year and practice in the offseason and put him next to Walker, who was playing really well towards the end of the year. He had two of his best games in the season or of his career against San Francisco and Miami. Those are two teams whose head coaches, Mike McDaniel, Kyle Shanahan, their sole purpose is trying to put linebackers in a blender. And Walker played really well that night. So those nights. So I think that matters. Hopper is a player that didn't really play much last year, played in the preseason. I would be stunned if they didn't bring back Eric Wilson. That's four guys that I've already mentioned. Do they pick a guy late for special teams or something like that? I think that's the type of player you're looking for more so than somebody to add to the defense. Who those guys are, some of that's going to be determined by the combine, I think. And then I'd have to look more into who's played special team snaps and stuff like that as well.
Well, appreciate you popping on. And, so I know you're still going through, as you said, you're still kind of going through guys or whatever. If you had to pick a guy right now, who do you think the Packers take at 23?
Kenneth Grant, defensive tackle, if he's available, but he's big. He goes to a Big Ten program, and I think he's going to test like an absolute freakazoid athlete. So
kind of like
Kenneth Grant
type freak athlete, because I know he tested really well at the combine, and he, wasn't for off the field stuff, he probably would have been a top 3-4 pick.
Who'd you cut out when you said that?
Carter.
Jalen Carter. Yeah, not as good as Jalen Carter. Jalen Carter is like the best interior defensive lineman in the sport, but I do think that Grant, again, he's 6'5", he's 340 pounds, and I think he's going to run really fast. His explosive numbers are going to be good. I really do. I think he's going to be a star at the next level. Star, I'm using the term relatively, not Jalen Carter, because I don't want to put those expectations on anybody, but I would be surprised if he's not one of those guys that were going, remember the buzz that was around Lucas Van Ness after he left the combine, and we were all kind of oh, so he's going to be a Packer. And then we all forgot about that for 2 months because we kept talking about receivers. I would not be shocked at all if that is the way that we look at Kenneth Grant by the end of this class, or by the end of the combine.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. Looking forward to your draft guides that you talked about, and look forward to reading your coverage on the draft. Thank you for spending some time talking NFL draft, and it's even more exciting that it's in Green Bay this year. I guess I'll just leave it at that.
100%, man. Can't wait. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Well, this has been Talking Sports with Evan, NFL Draft Talk. Another episode will be coming to you next week. I appreciate that. And the live show will be back this week as well. I will get back at you later.